Welcome to the Cuda Photography Podcast, a podcast about nature and wildlife photography in your own backyard and throughout the United States. Okay, welcome back to the podcast. This is episode 45, Composition, Part 2. We're talking about composition, and the first episode we talked about rule of thirds and how important it is to understand why human beings gravitate toward those 4 points or those thirds, vertical thirds, horizontal thirds, why that we tend to like that type of image. Well, along with that are a couple more rules. And one thing you have to understand is that rules are made to be broken, right? Nothing's set in stone. I've showed you last week or the week before last just how often I do break the rules. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you have a compelling reason to do so, please do so. So today we're talking about composition. We're talking about, first, the rule of odds. The rule of odds. What in the world is the rule of odds? The rule of odds is simply dividing our subjects into groups of odd numbers. So, for example, I might have a picture that has 3 birds or 3 singers. The idea is, or maybe 5. Maybe it's 5 birds or 5 singers. The idea is that you don't use even numbers. So, and particularly this applies to animals or people, but it can be other things as well. So why does this work? Why does having an odd number work? First of all, odd numbers give us a feeling of balance. If you think about even a pyramid, for example, pyramids have 3 points, and they give us this feeling of strength, this feeling of stability. We're kind of wired for that. Typically, when you see somebody using the rule of odds, it's usually 3. So when you're using this in your composition, the reason 3 works so good is I kind of alluded to that already, is that you can actually set up triangles in your image, which are visually appealing. So not only do you have 3, which is an odd number, but you've set up these lines running from subject to subject, so you can kind of really get some interesting images that way. And we're going to look at some images here right now. Okay, so if you go out here and you click on you click on your link, it'll take you out to a composition page or composition album that I created for the rule of odds. If you click on the first image, this is actually a film image that I took several years back with my Mamiya, and it's a medium format image, 6x7. And this was actually shot on Fuji Velvia film. But what I wanted to show you is that, one, you have the rule of odds going on here. So we have 3 bales of hay. Not 4, not 2, 3. Not only that, but we have a triangle formed by the 3 bales of hay. And what that does is that you kind of have these leading lines that bounce from the first bale of hay to the second bale of hay to the right, and then way out to that 3rd bale of hay, heading toward the background, and then back to that first big bale of hay. And it causes you to stay in the image, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to keep the viewer in the image and engaged. If I only had 1 bale of hay here, it wouldn't work as well. My eye would be drawn to the hay bale, and then to the leaves in the background, and then back to the hay bale. It just gives more elements, more interest, and that's what we're going for as photographers. We're going for that compelling image. This would be perfect as a calendar or whatnot. The only thing I don't like about this image was it's actually on a hillside, and so it looks like I actually didn't level up the horizon, but that's not true. It's actually level. It's that I'm actually taking the photograph on a hill. So this shot was taken up in Asaph Run, Pennsylvania in October of 2012 with my Mamiya RB67 Pro, 90 millimeter lens, and Fuji Velvia 50. Okay, the next image. Wow, I don't have a nature image. What do you know? I actually have an image of a human being. This is a shot I took of some kids at a musical at church, a Christmas musical, I believe it was. Yep, I can see Christmas trees back there. Again, the rule of odds being used heavily here. In the foreground, I have a picture of this girl with her hand pointed up into the air. I've got this light in the background that's giving some interesting backlight, red backlighting. But the more important aspect of this is I have three people forming a triangle, and that is a power move right there. That is a power move as a photographer. You'll see this pattern over and over and over again. If you start looking for this, you will find it all through nature. You will find it at concerts. You'll find cars lined up this way, bicycles, just about any objects you will find using this type of pattern. So it's very, very effective. I'm a big fan of the rule of odds. Okay, the next image. This is just an example of, this is a robin's nest that I took recently. And it's an example of when the rule of odds would have been better, frankly. Here I've got 4 birds. And I intentionally showed you this because it kind of gives you a little bit more of an uneasy feeling. You're not sure which birds to look at. You're not sure. Something just doesn't feel quite right. If there had only been 3 birds, now look off to the left of this image. If we ignore the bird in the foreground, and I actually cover it up with your hand if you want to, and ignore that bird in the foreground, you can see how much more compelling it is when the 3 birds to the left are together in a triangle. You know, hey, you win some, you lose some, right? You can't just go in there and pull the poor bird out and put him back later. That's not going to work. But I just wanted to show you how much more compelling it is to have an odd number versus an even number. Okay, let's move on now from that to the next rule of composition, which is the rule of space. No, I don't mean outer space. I mean the rule of space in your image. Simple definition, the rule of space is simply allowing extra room around your subject to give your subject room to move. We really do this all the time with wildlife photography. It's the idea that, let's say you have, and I'm going to give examples here in a minute, but let's just say you have a person running through a scene from right to left. You wouldn't want to position that person that's running from right to left on the left side of your viewfinder. You would want to position him on the right side of the viewfinder so it looks like he's actually running into the scene. You're actually providing space in front of him, around him, behind him, however it needs to happen in your particular composition. And that's really about all it is. It's along with this, there's also the notion of negative space. And I want to mention that briefly. Negative space is space that doesn't necessarily seem to serve any real purpose. It's space that helps to accentuate the subject, but doesn't necessarily have any qualities of the subject itself. And I don't know if I put any examples out there or not. Maybe we can talk about it as I go here. So with that, let's click on the second link, which will take you out to the Rule of Space album on my Flickr page. Now, the first image is of a common gallinule, and it's a fairly interesting image on its own without having any space. If you look at this image, it's got a reflection of the bird in the water, but it was missing something. And so what I decided to do was leave a bunch of space off to the right of the image so the bird could actually walk into the image. Now, in this case, the bird's not walking, but it still helps to give us a feeling that the bird has room to walk if it needs to. It also allows us to see more of the reflections of the various weeds and brush growing in this swampy area. I think it works here. I think it's a little bit of negative space, but not really. I wouldn't call this a negative space image. The reflections, I think, only add to the image. So there's the main subject of the bird itself, and then there's actually, underlying subject or secondary subjects as well. Okay, the next image. Okay, this is a great egret in flight. This is a typical scenario as wildlife photographers. Very typical. We got a bird flying from right to left. We need to give him a little bit of space in front so it makes the viewer more comfortable with what's going on. It doesn't look like the bird's going to run into the left side of the viewfinder or of the image. We feel like he's got room to move. And as wildlife photographers, that's really what I want you to get out of this discussion, is that your subjects need room to move. And so when we talk about space, that's what we're really talking about as wildlife photographers. And this image was shot with my Canon EOS 1D Mark II, f6.3, 150 millimeters, 1/1250th of a second, ISO 320, and that's my 150 to 600 millimeter Sigma contemporary lens. Okay, the next image. Okay, this image is of a double-crested cormorant, and I photographed this down in Huntington Beach State Park, South Carolina. This bird just happened to fly over at that moment. I was actually photographing some other birds at the time, and I saw him coming. I raised my 7D, and I snapped off some shots. Now, in post-production, I actually cropped this a little bit, and so when I cropped it, and this is another good takeaway from this, when I cropped it, I left space to the right so it looks like he has room to fly into the scene. Again, that space is so important. If I had taken that right side of this image and pushed it right up against his beak, it would have felt crowded. It would have been a very uneasy feeling for the viewer. It would not have been a good thing. I shot this with my EOS 7D, my Sigma 150 to 600 millimeter contemporary, f6.3, 600 millimeters, 1/2000th of a second at ISO 200. Okay, the next image. We've seen this before. I think I showed it last time actually, but it's an excellent example of the rule of space. Here we have a young bull elk, and he is entering the scene from the left, and he's exiting the scene to the right. And I've allowed plenty of space to the right. And in this case, maybe even a little negative space here to kind of reinforce it. But there is some other sub-qualities, complementary qualities to this image. In the background, you have the changing leaves, so we know it's autumn. And so having that background, having that space to the right helps in a couple different ways. And that's important too, I think, to note here is when you're photographing using the rule of space, think about not just the space, but what is interesting in that space. Are there trees in the background that, for instance, have pretty leaves? Is the background completely black? That could help show negative space to reinforce the subject, to simplify the subject. These are things to think about as you're actually photographing. And that's what, when you first look at the rules, you think to yourself, really? I don't know about this. But what happens is it forces you to think, and it forces you to think about how you're going to photograph the scene. And I think that's very, very important. This was shot with my Canon EOS 7D, the 150 to 600 millimeter contemporary lens, Sigma contemporary lens, 313 millimeters, 1/160th of a second at ISO 1600, and I was tripod mounted. Okay, so that's it for the rule of space. I got one more I wanted to talk about today, and that's simplifying. It's not a rule per se, but it's the idea of simplifying your image. At first, that sounds kind of nebulous to a beginning photographer, but what it means is I want to do everything I possibly can in my photograph to emphasize the subject. Maybe that's having a very clean background. Maybe it's having an out of focus background. Maybe it's both. Maybe it's using negative space to draw attention to your subject. Maybe it's removing those sticks from the foreground that are unattractive. Maybe it's cloning something out of the scene in post-production to help simplify the image. Basically, it's just simply defined as removing distracting elements from your composition until you're left only with what the viewer needs to see. And that's the important takeaway. You only want to have what the viewer needs to see. Okay, so let's go on out to my Flickr page. Click on the last link in the show notes. Okay, the first image out here is probably my favorite image. Out of all the images I've taken, this is without a doubt my favorite image. And what you have here is a black bear. You have an American black bear. You have a very simplified image. You say, well, what do you mean? The background, there's no background. There's no beautiful silky bokeh background going on. What do you mean I simplified the image? In this case, I simplified the image by actually cropping in my camera. There was no post-production cropping in this image. This was all done in my camera. I cropped it so that only his face is shown. You don't see his ears. You don't see both of his paws. You don't see all of one of his paws. We're locked in on his eyes. We see his eyes, his nose, and part of his paw and his forehead. And that is really engaging and a simple way to view this bear. Like I said, this one's won some honorable mentions. It hasn't won any awards, but it has won a couple honorable mentions. But I really do like it. I think it's a winner. I really truly believe this will win something eventually. It just has that feel, that and largely I equate that because I simplified this image. Okay, the next image. Okay, this mourning dove is also very simple, or simplified. I shouldn't say simple, it's simplified. In this case, I've used the trees in the background and my 600mm lens to great effect. I essentially have blurred the background out because I'm using a long telephoto lens. It's compressed and blurred that background. And I have the subject centered. It's very obvious what the subject is. It's this mourning dove. All my attention is drawn directly to this bird. So a very crucial element of photography. Okay, the next image. Okay, in this image, we have another very simplified image. In this case, I chose to use a white background. There's nothing more simple than a white background. It's not distracting. I can easily tell what the subject is. The subject is the hummingbird. The supporting subject is the flower, or the complementary subject. This photo works perfectly for me. It's one of my favorite images. And it's a perfect example, again, of simplifying your image. Whether it be the background, whether it be zooming in on the subject, however you slice it, this is a simplified image. It doesn't get much simpler. Now, could I have done some extra things here? Yeah, I could have cloned out some of the bad spots on the flower. That kind of stuff helps to simplify, but I'm not a big person that's into cloning my images, so I didn't do it. Okay, let's go to the next image. Now, this image, you're really going to kind of scratch your head and say, well, it doesn't seem very simplified, but it is. This is a image called Tribute, which was actually did win third place in a competition. It's a fly fishing rod and reel and flies and a net. And if you look at it, you can see immediately what the subject is, right? I wanted the user to see that there is an old rod and reel. I wanted them to see that there are flies there, so we're definitely talking about fly fishing. And I wanted the net to kind of make the background a little less cluttered. So I've simplified this image. I've shown the user exactly what I want him to see, or the viewer, I should say, exactly what I want him to see. So that's simplification, or simplifying your image. Great rules for composition. I think it behooves you to go and study this stuff, to learn it, practice it, get out there and actually start photographing things. That's really how you grow as a photographer, and I'm talking to myself as much as anybody here. That's how we grow. We get out and we photograph. We take these rules and we try to do something with them. Look for groups of 3 out there. Look for rule of odds. Look for space. Look to simplify your image. Look for the rule of thirds. It will immediately start improving your images. I can guarantee you that. Okay, so before we go, I just wanted to say, hey, thanks a lot. Thanks for hanging in there with me for 45 episodes. We're almost to 50 episodes. I might do something special for the 50th episode. I'm not sure yet. I'm not sure what that would look like. Maybe do a giveaway or something like that. But, keep getting the word out. Keep using social media, The idea is that every time I post something, you guys repost it. That helps to spread the word about the podcast. We're doing pretty good out there. We're definitely not at the top. We're never going to be at the top because we're a niche podcast. But, I see a lot of people. I get emails on a weekly basis from people. And so I know that we're getting a community, and that's what I'm really looking to do. I really want to build community, because going solo out there can be done, but it's a whole lot more fun with other people to share your hobby or share your profession. And the community is crucial. Not only that, but hey, you may meet some friends on here that'll last a lifetime, and that's what I'm kind of hoping for. So again, don't be afraid to email me. Don't be afraid to make suggestions. Maybe you'd like to have an area that we could all chat in, like a Facebook page, fan page, or like a some other social media platform that's out there that you want to use, like the Slack or something like that. So. Anyway, that's all I had for this episode. Thanks for listening. Make it a great day, and get out there and enjoy nature. Bye-bye. Music for this episode was provided by Dr. Turtle.